The United States is currently a fascinating laboratory of the mechanics of democratic decline. It has an executive president who is constitutionally answerable to nobody. If the presidency gets into the hands of somebody who does not accept the basic conventions of democracy, they are in really very serious trouble. It's quite important to remember that democracy is not the default position of mankind. The default position of mankind is some form of autocracy. Without the culture that sustains democracy, it won't survive. We will revert to what has been the norm for most of human history, which is an authoritarian system.
It feels like something new is happening in the past 10 years, where people are actually actively and unapologetically saying, this whole system doesn't work anymore, we want to throw the whole thing out. That's new. I'm going to start, if I may, by quoting yourself at you. Not in a kind of hostile Channel 4 News way, but just because I think it's a good start to this conversation. The transition from democracy to authoritarian rule is generally smooth and unnoticed. It is easy to sleepwalk into it. The outward forms and the language of politics are unchanged, but the substance is gone. These things do not happen with a clap of thunder. Democracy is not formally abolished, but quietly redefined. It ceases to be a method of government and becomes instead a set of political values, like communism or human rights, which are said to represent the people's true wishes, without regard to anything that they may actually have chosen for themselves. Looking specifically now at the United States, to begin with, how close to that description do you think they have come?
Well, I wrote those words well before the last presidential election, and I was astonished at how quickly my concerns became very obviously justified. I mean, the United States is currently a fascinating laboratory of the mechanics of democratic decline. It has certain peculiarities which it does not share with many other states. In particular, it has an executive president who is constitutionally answerable to nobody. He's not answerable to Congress except by way of impeachment. He's only subject to control by Congress so far as he depends on congressional grants of taxation. And the entire executive machinery is answerable only to him. And that is a uniquely powerful situation, which is matched only really by one European state, namely France. It means that if the presidency gets into the hands of somebody who does not accept the basic conventions of democracy, they are in really very serious trouble. That may actually happen in France in 2 years' time. At the moment, it looks quite likely that either Madame Le Pen or a synonym for Madame Le Pen or Monsieur Mélenchon may be the next president. What is happening in the States is that the presidency has fallen into the hands of somebody who has the three critical identifying characteristics of the totalitarian state. A cult of personality surrounding himself, the total identification of the state with himself, and a refusal to accept the legitimacy of dissent of any kind. Those are the essential ingredients of totalitarian rule. The only force that is capable of limiting what such a president does is the judiciary. And that, first of all, takes time. And during that time, a great deal of damage can be done. But secondly, it is not at all clear that the judiciary will end up by standing up for the Constitution rather than the president, because of the role that the president has in appointing federal judges and the fact that since the foundation of the Federalist Society in 1982, a succession of highly groomed judges have been eased into federal positions by Republican presidents, and such people now constitute a majority of the 9-man Supreme Court. It's a very dangerous state of affairs.
One of the things that you talk about in recent pieces is that democracy is not just the technical exercise of votes of the masses, it also belongs to a political culture.
Yes.
Would you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, democracy requires two things, One of them, the easy bit, is an institutional framework. Elections are only part of it. You need courts, you need civil servants, but what you above all need is something else. You need a culture which accepts diversity of opinion, which recognizes that the function of any workable democracy is to accommodate differences of opinion and interest which are inevitable in any large citizen body. And for that to work, you have to have institutions which command a confidence that transcends differences about particular issues. You have to care more about the system working than about winning on this, that, or the other issue about which you may feel strongly. Now, that is a purely cultural construct. It is what has sustained democracy during its relatively short existence. I mean, democracy is something that dates from the second half of the 19th century. I mean, women didn't get the vote in most countries until well into the 20th century, but I think something recognizable as mass democracy can be seen in Europe and North America from the 1860s onwards. It has been sustained by a variety of things, a great deal of good fortune, economic good fortune in particular. Democracy was born in a period of rapid economic expansion and European/North American domination of the world, and these conditions are now disappearing. It's quite important to remember that democracy is not the default position of mankind. The default position of mankind is some form of autocracy based on a claim to authority derived either from God or from ideology. We can forget God for the moment, but ideology is clearly the sole source of legitimacy in the eyes of those who voted for President Trump. I mean, I think one needs to remember that...
Well, he did win the election.
He did.
It's a source of legitimacy.
Well, it is a source of legitimacy, and that is really the interesting thing. There are Trumps in every society. The really sinister thing about Trump is that although he has been perfectly explicit about what he wants to do, a majority of Americans appear to want that kind of thing. Now, that is, I think, a symptom of the serious cultural disintegration of the democratic ideal. And without the culture that sustains democracy, it won't survive. We will revert to what has been the norm for most of human history, which is an authoritarian system based on ideology. You can include God in the ideology if you like, but ideology of some kind.
I think the picture you've painted would probably not be very controversial in terms of, I think you'd find people from the political left, political right, and everything in between pretty much agreeing with you. Where they would differ is whose fault it is. And how we got into this situation, because the irony is that the populists, the people, I suppose, who are showing, by your account, the least respect for democratic institutions and norms, themselves feel like they're the only true Democrats in the room because they are representing what people want and that they've been thwarted for decades by elites and obscure processes that have failed to deliver what they asked for. So which of these two sides between the kind of more conventional elite and the populists is the truer Democrat?
I think that what has happened is that most democracies are suffering from what I would call as a crisis of expectations. And this is to some extent inherent in the whole notion of democracy. A mass electorate will always look to democratic politics to create and vindicate their expectations. The expectations of electorates have progressively risen as the power of the state has risen. And what we have seen over the last 50 years in particular is a rising expectation of the state in respects in which either the state can't deliver at all, or it can only deliver at the expense of other goods that people value just as much. Clearly, in most countries, by far the most significant expectation relates to the economy. The delivery of economic well-being in its broadest sense is the principal expectation of democratic electorates. The state actually has only very limited control over economic ill fortune. It can certainly avoid creating it itself. Not all states do that, but it's possible. The state cannot deal with fundamental economic changes. Sometimes people think that the state can do this by essentially insulating itself from the rest of the world. That's never proved a successful stratagem. At the moment, Western democracies, having been the unquestioned economic leaders of the world for about 150 years or more, are in a position where they are facing competition from low-wage economies with relatively high standards relative to their past of education. The result has been that in most of the areas which have generated particularly middle-class incomes, industry, agriculture, extraction, these are no longer the central parts of a successful economy. Instead, the leadership of the West currently depends on a leadership in highly advanced technological fields. That leadership is itself fairly vulnerable. China is capable, with a moderate delay, of matching most things that the most advanced technologists in the United States or Europe can achieve.
So there's a sort of expectation gap
between not just an expectation gap, but it produces a big shift in the proportion of national income, which is in fact being earned by a relatively small number of people. I mean, the principal generator of economic equality is innovation, because innovation disrupts existing settlements and perfectly justifiably produces a disproportionate increase in assets and income to people who have perceived the opportunities before anyone else. So it is almost inevitably going to create a situation in which the traditional sources of income are declining and the new sources of income are highly concentrated in relatively few hands. Now, that is a source of very serious dissatisfaction. It's not that people necessarily diagnose it that way, but that is actually what's happening. It's definitely what is happening in the United States, where middle-class incomes have not increased in real terms at a time when real national income has increased very substantially and quite rapidly.
I mean, I would say that the picture you're painting of the economy as a driving force behind this decline and disillusionment makes complete sense.
When it's the principal one. There are many expectations.
The principal vector. But there have been countries getting poorer in the past. I mean, the 1970s in this country was not a period of great wealth and exuberance, but...
It's certainly not a period of great exuberance.
It did not result in the same level of questioning of the kind of democratic underpinning. So I wonder what else is going on. It feels like something new is happening in the past 10 years where people are actually actively and unapologetically saying, this whole system doesn't work anymore, we want to throw the whole thing out. That's new.
Well, people, what is happening is that people will say that the political system, not just the individuals, the system is not delivering the progressive improvement in our lives which we expect. Therefore, we must turn to some alternative source of authority. Now, there are various candidates, direct action, law in some people's minds, but by far the most significant alternative source of authority is the notional strongman. And I think one of the most revealing of many opinion polls which have tracked the declining fortunes of democracy in this country and other Western countries over the last 30, 50 years was the Hansard Society's 2019 poll, which suggested that 54% of the actually very large sample in Britain would like to see rule by a strong man who would not be bound by rules. Most of those felt that, parliaments and other sources of rules could be dispensed with, or at least could be ignored. Now that was quite a striking finding. I mean, I suspect that at different times you would have had different proportions, but strongmanism is by far the most potent alternative to democracy. All historical experience suggests that strong men do not get things done.
With your knowledge of history and watching what's happening at the moment, what do you think the most likely outcome is for these Western societies? What happens next?
Well, all prophets are wrong, and I would particularly like to be wrong about this prediction. I think that what will happen is that we will have an imperceptible move towards a more authoritarian style of government, which will accelerate after it's gone a certain part of the distance. It's what's happening in a rather shorter time frame in the United States at the moment. I think that sooner or later, people will wake up to the unpleasantness of the state of affairs that will usher in. I think one problem is that the replacement of democracies by authoritarian regimes is particularly difficult to reverse, because the democratic machinery which once enabled anything to be reversed will by definition have decayed. So that ultimately, however, what an overwhelming majority of a society wants will happen, however slowly, if it's possible. It's always possible to dispose of autocracies. Many states have done so, and we will too. But we will go through an unpleasant period in the interim. It will affect my children a great deal more than it affects me.
Do you think it will affect your grandchildren and great-grandchildren? How many years should we set aside for the rejuvenation?
I wouldn't begin to try predicting that. I think that it's a very long-term, cultural change, and that's what we're talking about, actually. Institutions can be changed. You can have a statute that can change institutions straight away. But the culture on which any kind of institutional change depends if it's going to succeed is a much slower affair. People expect cultural change to be reflected in the organization of public affairs straight away. A classic example is indignation at the slow pace of gender equality. If that's a very, very profound cultural change, it was always going to take many decades to be completed. I just cite that as one example. And the process of reverting from strongmanism to a more cooperative form of government will be equally slow.
And could take 500 as opposed to 50 years.
Well, it could take any period that you choose to name, and it's all going to depend on the politics and political development and external events which haven't yet happened and which I would be very foolish to try to predict.
What is sobering is that you don't seem to have any confidence that we can do much to affect a change sooner than that.
I think
we have to sort of hit rock bottom before we can reverse
we can,
out.
But we won't.
So what could we do? Give us a sort of something to hope for before we go into our interval.
My definition of virtue could come about overnight, but I've got enough experience of the way humanity works to believe that that's not going to happen.
But what could we do in this decade or in the next 2 decades? What should we be fighting for to try to either slow the decay or reverse it?
I think that we should reduce our expectations of the state. I think that we should have greater respect for the political process, because you can't have politics is the mechanism of any democracy, and you can't have democracy without politics or politics without politicians. I think that we need a much more cooperative and empathetic view about interests which conflict with our own. Now, these are all profound cultural changes which are a big ask. Historically, people have tended not to opt for things that undermine their personal interest. I accept that entirely. I'm not saying that they've got to acquire a completely new morality, but I am saying that if they don't, they're going to get something very unpleasant instead.